how far will he make it? Hey, I made it through the whole last one. And so Gary has made a video. I'm assuming it's to thank me for making through a whole video of his. And evidently, he's making a confession, too, that he's going to keep lying about my position. See, I'm not lying. I actually believe there is 400 years of evidence for the relativity of velocity, and there really is 100 years of evidence for the relativity of time-space. Whatever time-space is, we don't really know. The point is, we know certain things, like it warps. You don't have to know why the sun comes up in the morning to know the part that it comes up in the morning. Anyway, let's see how much we can get through together.
All right, Draft Science video was going to get onto the subject of forces in the disciplined, logical way, but instead I'm going to do this stupid pure response video. Just because there's just so many lies in it, and it just you know, you have to defend yourself against liars, and that's, you know, it's just one of the liabilities of life on this planet, is the liars can say disgusting things, and you know, they can get away with it, and so I mean, just for the record, I'm
Okay, so what I take from that is you feel you can get away with anything.
just going to, I mean, look, in the video I pointed out, he sits there and paraphrase me constantly. Keeps saying I'm claiming something I'm not claiming. So now he's saying I have in some way rejected Galileo by not accepting that Galileo believed.
No, I said that you've rejected, you said there's scant evidence for the relativity of velocity. Scant evidence. And yet there's a lot of evidence. So that's what you're in denial of. And Galileo believed in the relativity of velocity, that it was physically a real thing, and you don't. So you're rejecting Galileo's position.
That there was no such thing as absolute velocity. And I don't think there's any evidence that at all. I've never seen the quote of Galileo making any such speculations. He was just making the observation that perceptually we can't tell the difference. When you're moving, and you have velocity, not acceleration, that you can't tell you're moving. Nothing gives it away. And so therefore, if you're watching somebody else, you're going to see them relative to your movement. So if you're already moving towards them, and you see them coming towards you, you're going to end up adding both of those velocities in what you see. That's all. He's just talking about what we see, not what is, what we see. And he says that somehow I'm rejecting that.
You wouldn't know that encrypted, right? Because so time's going along, and our thoughts are forming, chemistry's happening, neurons are firing. Oh, and then time starts to go backward. Well, that wheel now is going backwards.
Right. So he's saying time can go backwards. He thinks that you can count these pieces of distance.
No, you might not be very bright. It was pointed out that if time could drift backwards, you wouldn't notice. I didn't say that that was happening. The point is, you wouldn't notice. You can have time. We need to be open-minded enough about what could happen with time to realize that even if time went backwards, we wouldn't notice. We'd be unnoticing things and unremembering things as the physics went backward. And when it started going forward again, it would feel perfectly continuously forward to us. It is a thought experiment to show that your senses are not on their own, are not the most reliable gauge of time. You know, another point would be sometimes things seem to go slow, and sometimes they're going fast. I play a video game that's a high-speed video game. Sometimes everything seems to be going slow, and by the way, I'm doing a lot better in those times. Sometimes everything's going way so fast. And I have noticed it has to do with my own metabolism, right? But I could just say, oh, no, sometimes time slows down. Sometimes it speeds up. No, I say that's not what's happening, that it just shows how sensitive our consciousness is to time. It's the fundament of a consciousness. And even if it was doing some weird things, there's reasons to realize we wouldn't notice that just on our own from introspection like you seem to do. Okay, so you have to misstate my opinion. I assume because you can't understand my opinion. That's what I've long assumed. But your obsession on that people are lying, as if I don't believe that there's experimental evidence for general relativity, but I'm saying so anyway. No, that's projection on your part. You must know better than the things you're saying. Okay, I don't. I think there really is 400 years of evidence. I think that those statement that Galilean invariance is meant to be a real physical thing is attributable to Galileo, just like people in the history of science say that it is.
It's in the movement of force in different frames in different ways. You not only can go forward, but you can go somehow backward. And I'd argue there's absolutely no evidence of that.
And I didn't say it really happened, did I? I said this was how open-minded we need to be about our concept of time.
That all movement is related to this thing called speed of force. So the speed of light is what we've connected it to, and we found a certain certainty that a certain amount of distance in open space will be covered by a force in a certain amount of time. That's it. That's all that's really been established, and that's the constant from which you can make comparisons. So if you could put a light clock, something that just measures, a photon goes 1 meter and then bounces back again, and that's your consistent measurement of time. His argument is that I can take that clock somewhere and it won't measure. It will measure a relative time. I can accelerate the clock, and the clock will somehow still function exactly the same. And my argument is kind of simple in this respect. That if you're moving...
Okay, so that is true. I am saying that, except for not that if you accelerate the clock. When you accelerate the clock, you're doing a transformation on your rest frame. Your rest frame's not at rest, it's being accelerated, which is also like you're being transformed from one rest frame to another. Right? If you start the clock after you're already moving, you're in your final rest frame. So you're moving it with a velocity relative to the other guy's spaceship. You start the clock then, yeah, it'll operate perfectly normally. That's what Galilean invariance says. And then Einstein comes along 3 centuries later and says this, if true, means some weird things about space and time, what you could call a distortion of space and time. And then that's physically real. And then it turns out there's ways to measure that. Right? General relativity gives us a way to track these changes through accelerating frames, through their transformations, and calculate what people would see, what the end result of a difference between two clocks that have gone through two different paths, one that was accelerated, one that wasn't.
Moving forward. Obviously the emitter and the reflector, okay? So this is your emitter and your receiver. And this distance is not going to stay the same if this experiment is moving. The experiment is moving. When the light leaves, the mirror is going to move towards it. So there's going to be a change in the perceived speed when you add the two speeds up. Okay, you're not going to have the speed of light anymore. You're going to have the speed of light plus the movement of the reflector towards the light.
And this is where you're disagreeing even with Galileo. Okay, but only when you interpret through Einstein. The light in that rest frame, those mirrors are not moving, right? We're on Earth. You're in a moving, accelerated reference frame at all times. And this does not happen. Okay, this is the weird fact that we've seen in the lab that you have to take into account.
Right.
All of science was forced to take Einstein's theory into account, not based on whether it made common sense to them or that's how their gut told them the universe works, but because you can show this. And the Michelson-Morley experiment specifically shows it. You bounce the light around so that it's traveling with the speed of the Earth in one direction and not in another, and then when the light joins back together, you can see whether the light spin shifted, whether some of the light's going faster or not. No, it's all going the same speed all the way around the circuit. I'm not lying, even if I was wrong, but it doesn't seem like there's a lot of reason to think that I'm wrong in that.
And that's going to be the practical speed, the actual effect speed, in the sense that you're not going to move the required 1 meter. Now you're going to move a lot less than a meter when you hit the mirror. So the argument's that simple. The light hasn't broken. What's broken is the experiment is broken, because the reflector is moving. And I'm arguing that velocity does the same thing to the guts of matter. It's moving the mirrors. It's moving the reflectors. All of the relationships of the material bodies inside of you are being altered when you have velocity. And the simple explanation for that is that your matter exists in 3 dimensions. And forces, like magnetism and gravity and light, these are all forces. The things that move the speed of light are force. And the elements of force, whatever you want to think of them as, waves or quanta, it doesn't, are whatever, balloons, arrows, fish, doesn't matter. The elements of the force are the thing that arrives. And the elements travel in straight lines. That's established by Maxwell and by all the other guys who did all those experiments with electricity, And so, yeah, light behaves the same way. It moves in straight lines until it hits something, until it interacts with something. It moves in a straight line. Now, his argument is because something's moving, that somehow there's a warp in the space, and now things can bend. Light can go around the corner because it falls into something, or it goes into some stretch zone where somehow the rules change. And I'm just simply arguing there's no evidence of a rule change. The effect is just this.
Okay.
Simple. You're changing the experiment. The light never changes. The experiment changes. The hardware the light's interacting with changes. All right, so yeah, the simple argument is that this is a photon. It's just a thing moving in a straight line. Matter adds these other 2 dimensions. This is what matter has. Okay, so matter has stuff not moving just in one direction, the speed of light. Matter has stuff in it moving in a lot of directions at the speed of light. And all of those directions have to be moved in the direction of your velocity. And it is the movement of those things through the capture of force that creates your velocity, the frame. And it's completely inside of you. So when you're moving, there's no change outside of you. There's only change inside of you. You change. Space doesn't change. Time doesn't change. Your matter changes. That's the simple argument.
And I have to reject something that stood the test of time for 400 years with Galilean invariance. Okay, I don't feel like doing that. If I said I did feel like doing that, then I'd be lying.
And it doesn't extend 1 tiny millimeter beyond you. Okay, the thing moving, the stuff moving the speed of light, the 3-dimensional stuff moving the speed of light is the only thing being affected. And that's what I mean by a broken clock, in the sense that you're not working the same. The mirrors are moving. They have to be moved. All right, and so obviously when you start accelerating matter, what you're necessitating is that you're creating more arrow going this way. Now, you can do that by capturing force between. So if there's 2 electrons and there's an amount of force between them, all right, the magnetic forces that are repelling them, you can add more force in between the electrons. And that's certainly a way of conveying this extra velocity, this extra amount of stuff going in the direction you're going to end up moving. You're changing the collective balance. So if you have a balance of equal amounts going in one direction, and then you add extra going in one direction in the form of force between your material bits, then obviously this will move at a speed. Now, this is going to be much slower than the speed of light, because matter's got a lot of other elements that have to be pushed. Each one of them has to go, and they don't go on their own. The elements don't have momentum.
Yeah, I don't follow this, because you said that you're saying that matter is just a bunch of these speed of light things. So, but it has to be pushed, but it's really all speed of light stuff. Incoherence.
Momentum, except in the direction they're traveling. So the quanta only can go the direction they're going. They can never carry momentum. So unlike the baseball analogy, if I'm on a train and I throw a baseball off the train horizontally, perpendicular to my movement, at somebody on the ground, let's say, stationary, obviously I can't just throw it normally, like what I'm seeing. If I throw it as I see it, the baseball will miss him entirely, because the baseball is going to keep going the direction I'm moving. So it's going to go, let's say, 60 miles an hour this way, and it might go 70 or 80 miles an hour the way I'm throwing it. And the combination is going to be this thing over here. The baseball is going to end up way forward of where I intended, or where I threw it, because the baseball is going to keep my momentum.
Photons aren't like baseballs any more than they're like bullets, right? And that's the amazing discovery that we've had to wrap our head around.
A beam of light won't do that. So if I'm in a spaceship moving, and I shoot a beam of light perpendicular to my movement, it's not going to move forward with me. It's not going to keep
10
going.
minutes.
It's going to go exactly where I shot it. Nowhere else. And where I shot it, if you're the camera and you're attached to me, you're going to move too. You're going to move out of the way of the light. The light's not going to be able to get to you before you disappeared. You left the scene. And that's the truth. So obviously a light clock.
No, it's not the truth. That's
Velocity.
that's your thought experiment that doesn't take into account the experiments to the contrary.
And that was one of the points I was making. All right. So what else do I want to say? So anyway, yeah. So I think that a real understanding is just to understand this dimensionality argument. The elemental particles are these quanta moving the speed of light. They only exist in one dimension, the dimension they're moving in. That's the only dimension they have mass in. I think it's just fundamentally important to understand that. Anything else, okay, like electrons might be two-dimensional. They might be three, but I think they're only two because they can't maintain any kind of velocity. You can accelerate them, you can push them, but they'll not maintain where you threw them. You always have to throw them with a bunch of force to continue.
So now, in your system designed to make perfect common sense, you've got arbitrary dimensionality comments, which I don't. I only know about the three-dimensional space when I'm talking about my common sense experience, so it's not clear exactly what you mean.
And you mean to push them. You have to push them with force, or they'll stop moving. And the same with protons. So the elemental bits don't do this maintain your inertia thing. It's only the complex structure of a material atom that can do it. And it does it, okay, by essentially...
Okay, those paying attention, next man to fall, Gary doesn't believe in the conservation of energy.
rolling on the space by the proton and the electron rotating their positions to each other. And the only way they can do that is they have to migrate.
So how does a one-dimensional thing rotate? Odd. Doesn't seem possible. But then again, dimension could mean anything. Who knows? Maybe it's a word for a school of fish.
Force. They have to take force that came in and somehow keep reapplying it. They have to keep it, they have to cycle it through them. And they probably do that.
And you don't understand why I'm claiming you reject Galileo. Galileo's velocity relativity, and you're saying you have to keep exerting energy to keep this thing at velocity, and you don't understand why that is a rejection of 400 years of mechanics. And you hate waves.
This, you know, I don't know in this video if I need to
I think Gary might have had a bad experience at the beach, and he's just held it against waves ever since.
explain, but they probably do that by a disproportion of the bits. So they say if there was more electrons, then that means the force has to go through and push the electrons forward. And that would take a lot longer than if there was only two on the other side going back. Then the force can go back really quick, and that would sort of be the change. But it's all this back to this square box thing. That when force goes into an electron, it can come out completely perpendicularly. So you can put force in this side, and it'll come out completely perpendicularly. And that's the power of electrons. And so obviously they can trap force. And that's a very interesting feature of the
Yeah, obviously.
function of matter. The individual electrons aren't really doing the moving. The force is doing the moving. But the electrons are channeling the force to make that possible. All right. I don't want to get into this too deep. I mean, I don't want to get into the material changes because it's not the substance of this argument. The substance of this argument is there's no hard evidence of any kind of bent time dimension. There's only hard evidence of a correlation between giving matter velocity and it changing in terms of its function. And that would be my argument is that's because it has a whole bunch more force moving inside of it.
Look, I already said I'm willing to call this broken. Time can be broken and then fixed again. It's not warping. It's just the exact same effect, the exact same result, and we call it warping. Oh, but I want to call it broken. Okay, why is that? Okay, it's broken.
That's while it's moving. It got force. And as Newton would say, it's going to keep moving until another force acts on it. Takes the force away or applies the force in the opposite direction to negate the force.
Is it just me, or did you just contradict yourself?
The electrical impulses, electrical impulses that were going forward, they're now unrolling. They're going backwards. The memories that we're forming through our chemical processes in the brain, whatever they are, they're going backwards, right? Time going backwards just means that all the physics that we have goes backward.
All right, I'm just saying I don't see any evidence of anything ever going backwards, as he says. So he can say.
Well, my point is you wouldn't see it. Also, I'm not saying it happens. It's to show you how if something that radical was happening, you still wouldn't see it with your regular sensation. Figuring out a way to test it is even mind-boggling. So, because all of every measurement device would be running backward. If a video of time existing had taken place when time went backwards, it'd be erased. So, wait, totally missed the point. Because that's your job, is missing the point.
Say it, but I don't think there's any evidence of it.
The way the math works out, it's actually fine with physics that things time might go backward.
Right, so whatever. So they have math for a false circumstance that has no relation to any real circumstance. Great. And that's more evidence of why they're right, is because they have math that details Bugs Bunny's hat.
And we wouldn't know.
Yeah, no, the point of this is really the issue of there's a big question in physics, since the equations run backwards and forwards just as mechanically, then why is time moving in one direction? Maybe it's thermodynamic rules. Maybe it's the increase of entropy has a directionality in time. So maybe that's related to why we feel a directionality in time.
No, because time's, drifted back to here, and we've unremembered everything over here. We've forgotten it. We've unremembered it because we didn't even forget it.
Yeah, we've unremembered it. We erased it, in other words. Somehow. We went there, and then we erased the trail back. Isn't that convenient?
You don't understand why in this hypothetical situation, if you have in forward in time something recording a video and you run it backward in time, it'll be erasing the video. I thought that was like super common sense. Not that it's happening, but that if you had that situation, of course it would be erasing your memories. And this is just a thought experiment to show you how open-minded you're going to have to be if you want to contemplate what like the time fundamentally is, right? Because we've lost this, well, it's just a universal clock. Why? Because, of course, I evolved to expect it that way, and it is. So what's the question? But we know there's no universal clock now. We, not you. Gary doesn't know. And therefore, it raises this question of, well, what is time physically? What's causing it to happen? And it could be just that our chemistry relies on a certain order of events, and that imposes the concept of time. Right? That's very vague what I'm saying, because the point is, what time is fundamentally is a very open question.
It's actually our brain moved backwards, and we unraveled all those memories, and now here we are going forward again. And it's just like a piece of film. You can look at it the other way and see things run it backwards and whatnot, but the things in the film, it just has this forward character.
Yeah, whatever. So all of this because I claim that Galileo never said there was no absolute velocity. He just said that you can't perceive velocity.
Right, but you're wrong. And if you look up Galilean relativity and Galilean invariance, it's attributed to him. Now, what did he know 400 years ago? More than you, evidently. So I'm wondering how many thousands of years backward you're willing to go.
Accurately. You can't see it.
Right? We go back and then start going forward. And we'd think once we got back there that we would know that an hour ago we were in the future. We would think that an hour ago we were in the past. And then, boom, continuity. And even if things could change, we would go in different paths, we would have this sense of continuity, right? So there's
I don't even know what all this crap came out of.
Obviously
that's
not.
My video. That's for
well,
sure.
Not everything's about you.
Time could play on us. So time could just be a physical process.
Yeah, time could just be a physical process. So again, the argument is...
See, maybe you should watch more of it then, because when you watch this part as the 5-minute segment that it really is, then I think it was pretty clear it's a thought experiment to inspire you to be open-minded. The audience, not just you, you're hopeless, but the audience about just how tricky weirdness in time is. We're so dependent on a time for every concept of perception that, we don't even count in our stream of consciousness the fact that, well, if time does something weird, it'll affect us. We don't even expect that. We don't say that some of our memories were unmemories No, it's the ones we have that are our memory that constitute our idea of the past and thus the future, right? So the point was a thought experiment to keep you open-minded. Obviously, that was not a message to you, but to the rest of the audience, because you don't want to remain open-minded. You already know how everything works. It's all going on. Why be open-minded?
Is that we already figured out what time is. That's what all the forces are doing. It takes time for a force to get from point A to point B in distance, and that time is set. And the only thing that can affect that time is if it goes through a substance where it may not be traveling a straight line, and that's why it takes longer, is because it has to be.
And the whole of humanity, we've discovered this, and we agree on it. We know already. Oh, wait, no. We have discovered, we know what time is, means that Gary knows, and Gary's going to assume everybody agrees with him, because why wouldn't we? He's right. Makes total sense, right? It's totally rational. You take a principle. Gary's right. Right? You take another principle. Something Gary says. You take another principle. We want to be right. Therefore, you can assume that we, in effect, agree, and if we don't agree, we're broken.
Basically ricochet, so to speak. It has to be absorbed and readmitted to get to the other side. And therefore, it can't travel its normal straight line speed because it's not traveling a straight line anymore.
It is possible that there's certain chemistry where they form their memories in the reverse order of time. We'd see them living their life.
Except for here's the thing. When you have refraction, say a piece of light hits a glass surface at an angle, and so it gets bent, just like the bent stick in the water. That's the traditional example, right? It gets bent, and then it goes straight through, then it hits the other side, and it gets unbent the exact same amount. So it's made, its path outside and then through the glass is made of 3 straight line segments. Not everything does this. Some things hit and scatter and start actually bouncing around and come out at a random angle. Some other situations. So I think, what you're describing sounds like a random butterfly path that would lead to a random exit angle. But we don't see that. We see a very consistent angle made of straight line segments, bent at when light is entering a substance by a known amount relative to the refractory index of that material.
Lives backwards, and they would be
Or
experiencing.
both
Yeah,
materials.
again, there's just nothing. There's no way to make any sense out of this idea that you go backward, that there's some sort of undo the space you traveled. There's nothing. There's no evidence you can do that. I can take time to move a force from one place to another, and then I can take time to move it back the opposite.
No, you're just supposed to be able to imagine that if time was going backward, all the chemistry in your brain would go backward, and so everything you experienced in the forward direction would be what you could call unexperienced. It'd be reversely experienced. And when it comes to memories and all cognition, that means losing all knowledge of the future. And the reason to consider that is because then maybe you'll understand just how you can't sit in your house in Mendham and say, well, I've seen time my whole life, so obviously it's got to be this way that I have concluded. Because no, funny business in time will have a tremendously strong power basically to fool you about what's going on, because you're going to see time one way because of the way your chemistry operates. So you're going to see time that way because you're going to piece it together that way no matter what's really happening with time. So we'd have to get clever about our understanding of time.
Direction somehow, and somehow I didn't consume the time going forward and the time going backward. Of course, I consumed both of them.
It forwards in their own direction. I don't know. I'm not saying that is the case. I'm saying we have to be pretty open-minded about time.
Well,
Okay, so I'm not saying it is case. I'm saying let's get...
I don't see any evidence of your open mind. Anybody even just question your authority, and you go insane in terms of insulting.
Well, this is projection. I've not claimed any authority. I say there's evidence and stuff, and mostly it's things that scientists have done. You're the one that claims to have a gut authority, and I think that's pretty obvious, making this pretty obvious projection.
Their intelligence. So fuck you in this bullshit that you have any respect for the lack of evidence you possess to defend these stories about Bugs Bunny's hat.
Oh, I entirely do. And in my discussions with Heisel today, it's very much, my use of the concept of space-time is not to be taken as advocacy for a particular concept of space-time a particular person has so far. We're trying to figure out what that phenomenon works. And I have used this example. The sun comes up, and you could say, so what's going on? And your friend, the priest in the temple of Apollo is like, well, that's Apollo's cousin there, and he's dragging the sun. It's a fiery chariot. There's fire on the bottom. He's dragging it across there, obviously. Like, well, that's more of an explanation than I had a minute ago. Okay, but I'm going to keep looking into it. No, it's some sort of a heavenly body that's traveling. My astrology friend says that it's it's hooked to the celestial, its own celestial sphere, and they're all rotating, and it's the dance of the cosmos. I'm like, okay, well, that's more information. It works a little better than the chariot thing. Tells me a little bit more. Keep looking into it. Find out, the sun is actually like the stars. It's different in size and particulars, but it's a star. Why does it look so different? It's so much closer. We're going around it. Why? Gravitational forces, Newtonian mechanics. Okay, but why those things? Right? And we're zeroing in on more and more accurate concepts of how things work. And that's the skeptical approach. That's the scientific approach. Your approach, Gary, is our gut already tells us the truth, and all we need to do is find the right color of arrows to convey what our gut thinks.
Because all you have is evidence. It's a correlation between velocity and a delay in decay. Nothing else. Yeah, it's a delay in absolutely every physical process.
Okay, now where did he have evidence of that? Where does he have evidence that every single physical process is equally delayed? Where's the evidence of that? I've seen no evidence that changes in velocity, going somewhere.
Well, for example, just the atomic clock experiment where they put an atomic clock in orbit long enough that they would be able to measure the change in the time in the two clocks. An atomic clock is not just an atom flying in space. It's a lot of machinery to turn the vibrations of the atom into, a readout. Tick, 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 tick. Right? And if it's only atomic decay and only, those things that are changing, right? Then the rest of that apparatus would get out of sync with the clock. That doesn't happen, all right? So in every single example, whether it's muon decay or an atomic clock or, any one that we can have the technology to test, they all go equally slowly. That's why. If you sent up a clock and parts of the clock were all traveling at different time periods, I would suppose you could detect that, right?
Well, I mean, it's such a tiny amount of what we can measure as it is now, the tiny amount of time lag. You're talking about seconds over maybe millions of miles traveled at very high speeds. And here he is talking as if he knows that every single thing in a proportional manner somehow gets done slower.
Well, I know it at least as much as you know the shit you're saying. And also, I'm just saying what the real theory is we're trying to present. This is how the other side sees the time dilation. It's specifically because it affects the decay of any particles. It affects everything that we could test so far, and it predicts that it affects everything moving in that everything that's in that rest frame, right? So that's the prediction. We put it up there with a clock chosen not because it's supposed to be affected by this, but because any clock would work. We just want the best clock we have on Earth so that it could be accurate enough to notice these differences. And then we send up that clock and you're like, oh, it's because it's an hourglass. Well, it wasn't an hourglass because it was, An atomic clock. Yeah, well, that's the most accurate timepiece. Put up a different kind of timepiece that's accurate. Put up a clock. I mean, a grandfather clock. And run it long enough. Make sure your grandfather clock's accurate enough. We predict you'll see the same thing that you've seen already. That clock was not chosen because, the theory does not predict that just not microscopic, but just, quantum functionality is different. Everything slows down. All of chemistry, all of physics, right? And again, there's experiments. Now, have we tested, I said in my video, have we tested every single kind of physical process? How could we? There's a lot of physical processes we can't measure their time, so we're stuck with the ones we can measure. But as it adds up and there's no exceptions and nobody could come up with anything that shows an exception, hey, look, this process ran at the same speed. And so people can't get their hands on that and try to explain that and see why that would be, because it hasn't happened. Nobody's coming up with that example. And all you have against it is that you're sure it's got to be differently. Well, there's 7 billion people that are equally able to say they think there must be a creator of the universe.
I'm not saying that's not true. I'm saying there's just absolutely no evidence to verify that one way or the other.
So not just decay, but in every process.
Well, again, if it was in every process, we know that certain other chemical processes take a certain amount of time. So again, where's your evidence that, let's see, I don't know what would be a good clock. I mean, all these clocks are always going to be dependent on gravity, number one. It's hard to go fast in gravity, so you usually have to go out of gravity to go fast. And so most of the process...
An atomic clock doesn't rely on gravity. Why would you even say something like that? God only knows. Do you believe? I guess you believe it. So all clocks depend on gravity.
Processes we're familiar with happen in gravity. And so maybe they automatically function differently when you take them out of gravity, like an hourglass, for example.
Plus, the distortions have also been studied through length.
See, Einstein came up with this thinking, like, what is the perfect clock? Whether we could build it or not, what would ideal clock that could tell us, time on some fundamental level, like that time would, like, as directly as possible be driving this clock. That's why he specifically did not use an hourglass, a geared clock. No.
Contraction and mass distortion.
Well, again, so he claims he has really hard evidence of this stuff, and so again, he has never posted any links to any of it.
You don't even post the link to my video that you're replying to. I'm not going to feed you any more links. I have, and I'm sure you have access to Google, and you could look up experimental evidence for mass distortion.
This stuff, he just says, you go out and find it. So I have to go out and find his proof. No, I'm not doing that.
Well, the thing is, though, your proof all comes out of your ass, so you have quick access to it. I'm talking about 400 years of experimental evidence and 10 years of you rejecting when I put right in front of you an experiment. We've just have the Michelson Morley experiment on the table, and you have nothing of value to say to it. You obviously don't understand what it's attempting to demonstrate, why it successfully demonstrates that with a negative result, and how you might criticize that. You just reject it. So that's one of the most famous experiments ever. I'm supposed to go to lesser known experiments so that you can just each one. He was the woo-woo guy. Huygens was just so into quantum mechanics. Oh, really? He lived hundreds of years before quantum mechanics? Okay, let's move on. Yeah, I'm not going to run around for you. This is easily... I mean, literally, if you look up length contraction, experimental evidence section in Wikipedia, you could get a head start on this. So I know you're not looking for it. You're spending all your energy ignoring it. Why would I spend hours and hours and thousands of hours if I was to try to go through 400 years of evidence for velocity relativity, 100 years of evidence for general relativity? Why would a sane person do that for you?
Who's denying it? So again, this false accusation that somehow the evidence has been denied. What evidence do we have?
You said that there was no evidence for the relativity of motion, that it's weakly evidence. there's actually 400 years of thousands of people in every culture on earth.
Right, so I could just do that. There's 2,000 years of evidence that Jesus Christ died on the cross for our sins. The evidence is hearsay.
Right, because you don't know the difference between a laboratory experiment and evidence for Jesus being our Savior. You can't see the difference. I see the difference. I think most of us atheistic observers of this video know the difference between those two things. You're the one saying that the evidence gathered by science has no more weight than the so-called evidence of miracles and stuff that the Catholic Church offered for thousands of years. They're the same kind of thing, according to you. But most of us that believe that science is a little more grounded in reality, oh, we disagree with that. We think that the evidence that's in play in the scientific method is different from revelation. You don't. And that's why your system is entirely based on your personal revelations.
And so it's by popularity now. There's no real hard evidence anymore. I mean, the testimony of somebody actually witnessed it. We don't have that anymore, obviously. Can't interrogate the witnesses. So what do we have?
You can interrogate the science results, though, by picking up the experiments they claim to have done that evidently they were lying about and doing them and showing that the results are different than predicted. Right? This isn't just popularity. They write down a recipe. Do this and you'll see this result. And we think that that means the following. And you go, you do that and see a different result, then you could go, it can't mean what they said.
As evidence. It's weak. And all I'm saying is the only thing we have evidence of is that velocity changes atomic decay. There's probably other things the velocity changes. As I'm pointing out, the matter fundamentally changes. But I would bet that all the changes don't happen in exactly the same proportion.
See, what you don't get is what's predicted, and this would be an interesting experiment, is if you have two satellites and you put them up, say, going opposite directions around the Earth, right? Satellite A and satellite B. You're going to run this twice. You run them, and then you take satellite A, you turn on the thrusters and get it to catch up with satellite B. And then you measure. Satellite A's clock will be behind. Then you redo the experiment. And this time, though, at the end of the experiment, you put the thrusters on B and have it match spaceship A. And then B's clock would be behind. So which one was moving at velocity and got broken depends on subsequent acceleration events. Yes, I know, Gary, you can deny that things could possibly work that way, but that's the current prediction. And from all the experiments that we have done, we could be pretty sure that that's what would happen in that case.
I mean, if you can find different clocks, that's the trick. What other way can you make a clock? I mean, the great thing about an atomic clock is it's an incredibly simple clock. Not the detecting of the radiation, but that's not simple. But the thing making the timing cycle, the thing doing the timing, is a real simple mechanism. It's all the way rudimentary in atoms. So it's hard to find another clock, okay, that is fundamental as that. And I said the only example I can give you is like a light clock, but light clocks won't function in any of the circumstances you want to place them in.
Earth producing this evidence. So that's what I'm saying you're denying.
So again, I'm 400 years ago, Newton said, I have to believe there's no absolute velocity. I mean, Galileo said that. I don't think he ever said that. And if he did say it, why do I have to accept that? What evidence?
You don't have to accept it. I'm pointing out that your rejection that started out rejecting 100 years of science is now rejecting 400 years. You're perfectly allowed to do that. You may reject any, I mean, I have a feeling from this video, conservation of energy, we have a lot of things left for you to reject.
The base it on. He didn't know what a photon was, for fuck's sake.
So you get confused. Now you're talking about the time distortion, but this...
No, that was the subject of your video.
No, the subject of the video was Galilean relativity. It was right in the title.
This video is really about the history of that.
So the history of the thing I'm talking about. Right, that's exactly what I'm talking about. That's the subject. Yes, that's what I'm talking about.
You're not just denying the part where Einstein says, hey, if Galileo's right...
No, he didn't. Einstein didn't say if Galileo was right. Einstein knew Galileo was right. I mean, Einstein knew, okay, that if two trains pass each other, he knew, yeah, they're not going to be able to tell because there's no...
Gary, if light works the way you say, like the bullets, then you could tell who was moving, because when you fire off the light, you will see the light is leaving you a little bit slower. And so you create a device to measure that, and you could see who was moving and who was not moving. So if you can't tell fundamentally, really can't tell, it doesn't mean you don't have the device, but theoretically in this theory you could not tell, then it means that time and space and mass have to distort so that time is consistent locally.
Nothing in between the two moving trains that's stationary. So the only way you can know is there has to be something stationary.
No, you could know by measuring your speed relative to light.
In your perception, you have to have a reference. Without a stationary reference, you can't tell who's moving.
The universal grid that you think exists, you could measure your rate of speed relative to it.
Einstein didn't need Galileo to say it, but he certainly knew that was...
Because you think light is traveling through that medium, right? And its velocity adds and subtracts to your velocity. So you could tell, and as a matter of fact, it'd be very easy to tell because you could just fire a laser, in two directions at right angles, and the color of light would be different in the forward direction versus the backward direction. In the side direction, if you're moving, it would have a different wavelength of light coming out. Well, no, you don't believe that. It would have a different speed. And so you could measure. Your stationary reference would be the medium that light's traveling through. The thing that gives light its constant velocity. You believe light has a constant velocity relative to this, whatever it's traveling through. And therefore, you could measure the difference between your velocity and light's velocity, and you would have your absolute speed. So Galileo and Einstein are saying, no, that's not possible. Not just because we don't have the technology. They didn't say, hey, build this thing and get your... No, they said relativity. You literally can't ever find out which is moving and which is at rest, because physically, both statements are equally true.
Was already established as a fact.
Then this other weird shit
It
happened.
wasn't like a if he is right. Everybody knew that if you stood on a moving object and threw something, the thing you threw was going to move how fast you're going plus what you threw. And the only time that doesn't work is with force, because force can't carry your momentum.
Has to be true. We checked that it was true.
So again, what did you check that was what was true? Again, I'm saying the only evidence you have is a connection between velocity and changes in material function. What other evidence do you have of any kind of warp in time?
You're not just disagreeing with that. You're disagreeing with Galileo's concept that the velocity is truly relative.
Okay, so you're saying it's truly relative. So I didn't see a Galileo quote where he said all velocities are truly relative. That he somehow knew that the baseball doesn't really go 120 miles an hour when it's on a train and then somebody throws it in a direction. And that fundamentally, well, I mean, it is true. The stationary object could be moving. So that's the problem. But I'm just saying, because Galileo pointed the problem out of perception, that you can't perceive without something that is the reference, that he was saying there's absolutely no such thing as velocity, that it's always just some sort of relative thing, and that you can't gain any absolute velocity.
Okay, well, this is getting on coming towards an hour, so I don't even know if I want to finish this. This is but it's kind of, I said that if he didn't, if he stayed on his science ideas, that I'd stick with it. So I kind of think, okay. On the other hand, it doesn't mean I have to do it, but this definitely, this particular thing makes me want to find some quotes of Galileo and exactly how did he put it. I don't think it's that important. Makes that big of a difference, exactly how Galileo put it. But I was taught this through science, where we were busy learning this idea of actual relativity, and that was attributed to Galileo. But it would be interesting to see his actual quotes on the matter. Gary misunderstands a couple things. It wasn't that Einstein didn't believe in Galilean relativity, but it's still proper to say, if Galilean relativity is real, then the following things. Because then if you do an experiment and find the following things, like light does bend or whatever, then that's evidence that the premise that it's based on is true. It's a way to prove that Galilean relativity is true. And the last holdout we had was measuring our speed relative to photons. And if photons are traveling at a certain speed, like water waves do, relative to their medium, then we could get our velocity relative to that medium. And the fact that we couldn't do that, Michelson-Morley experiment, sort of was the final nail in the coffin. But the vampire's still inside the coffin, banging on the roof. But my gut!